As I am now at the conclusion of the theory of spirits, I am bold enough to say that this study, if properly used by the reader, exhausts all philosophical knowledge about such beings, and that in future, perhaps, many things may be thought about it, but never more known. This assumption sounds rather vainglorious, for of such multifariousness are the problems offered by nature in its smallest parts to a reason as limited as the human, that there is clearly no object of nature known to the senses, be it only a drop of water or a grain of sand, which ever could be said to be exhausted by observation or reason. But the case is entirely different with the philosophical conception of spiritual beings. It may be complete, but in the negative sense, by fixing with assurance the limits of our knowledge and convincing us that all that is granted to us is to know the diverse manifestations of life in nature and its laws, but that the principle of this life, it is the unknown and only assumed spiritual nature, can never be thought of in a positive way, because for this purpose no data can be found in the whole of our sensations, that therefore we have to resort to negations, for the sake of thinking something so entirely different from everything sensuous, but that the possibility of such negations rests likewise neither upon experience nor upon conclusions, but upon invention, to which a reason deprived of all other expedients finally resorts. With this understanding, pneumatology may be called a doctrinal conception of man's necessary ignorance in regard to a supposed kind of beings, and as such it can easily be adequate to its task. Immanuel Kant. Kant's critique of pure reason is really a critique of the metaphysics of Kant's time, that is mainly of the Leibniz-Wolffian school of philosophy, which was the most prominent in German philosophy in the 18th century. And everything else, Kant's epistemology, that is his theory of cognition, which I explained in a lot of detail in previous lectures, is really a sort of preparation and propedeutics to that. That being the part of the critique of pure reason dealing with the transcendental dialectic. I talked about what that is in the previous lecture. Reason to Kant is the faculty of thinking a priori. It is the faculty of principles that I also explained in its own lecture on what is reason. And it is the part of our thinking that seeks to deduce the specific, the singular, the individual case from a general, universal even, principle, from a first, from an absolute. And so reason has this desire for the absolute, for totality. And that is what births the ideas. The ideas, as I explained in the same lecture on reason, are concepts of reason describing a maximum. Reason sort of takes the concepts of the intellect and increases them, because for everything that is conditional, reason demands totality of all the conditions, and therefore it demands something unconditional. And that is the idea. And in the previous lecture on dialectic, I explained how that gives rise, according to Kant specifically, to the three ideas that metaphysics mainly deals with. The ideas of God, of freedom or the world, and of the soul and the immortality of the soul. And this leads to three fields of philosophy. And one of those fields, the field I want to deal with in this lecture, would be what is called rational psychology, which is not to be confused with empirical psychology, which through experience tries to, explore our mind and how our mind in this empirical world works. But rather, rational psychology deals in a metaphysical way with the soul. What is the soul? How does the soul work? And the soul, according to Kant, is one of the necessary ideas of reason. Reason demands an absolute substance, something which truly is a subject and not a predicate of something else. But reason here is dialectical, meaning reason gets caught up in wrong arguments that may seem true, that may seem compelling, but really aren't true. And so in his dialectic, Kant is trying mainly to lift the illusion that reason creates for itself here. And in rational psychology, these wrong arguments by Kant are called paralogisms. Now, paralogism to him means an argument that is formally incorrect. So we can abstract from the content of the argument and from whether the content is correct or incorrect. I mean, the conclusion of the argument could still be true in the end, but it would then be true for another reason, not for the reason the argument claims. But the argument as such has some formal error. I talked about in the lecture on what is reason, I talked about how the conclusions of reason are called syllogisms. And they usually are made up of two premises, a major and a minor, like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, and then they draw a conclusion from that. Socrates, therefore, is mortal. Now, wrong arguments, according to Kant, can be either paralogisms or they can be sophisms. Now, a sophism is if the argument is wrong, but the person arguing knows that it is wrong and comes up with a wrong argument on purpose to fool other people. A paralogism, on the other hand, is when the person arguing himself doesn't know that his argument is wrong, and he's not fooling other people, but rather he's fooling himself. And what Kant is claiming is that when it comes to the soul, it is in the nature of our reason to create such paralogisms, so to fool ourselves. And to be more specific, there are 4 paralogisms that Kant talks about. 4 because of the fourfold structure of the table of categories. I have my own lecture on the table of categories, and I would advise to, if you haven't yet, to listen to that one first. Now, the specific arguments were arguments that had been used by various metaphysicians before and that Kant didn't come up with. What is new, what is, so to say, Kant's contribution is the structuring of them, giving them the place in the architectonic of a system according to the table of categories. And what is new is the claim that they are not just arguments that some thinkers happen to come up with, but rather they are arguments that our reason, if we reflect on this matter, comes up with by necessity, by its very nature. Um, I will first talk about the four paralogisms. I won't go into the detail of the actual arguments. If you care about that, you can read Kant himself, because this lecture is supposed, like all my lectures, to give lay people, to give a greater number of people an understanding of what Kant is about. But it is not there to simply replace Kant and to go into the actual details of all the argumentation. I don't think that is necessary here. I don't think to understand him, you need to know the actual specific arguments. It should be enough to know what he's dealing with and how, in general, he solves the problem. So, first, what are the four paralogisms about? Well, first we have the one of quantity. And when it comes to the quantity of the soul, there is the paralogism of identity, stating that the soul is one and always the same, always identical with itself. So we don't one day have one soul and then another day it gets replaced with another soul, but rather the soul is always identical with itself. And this identity of the soul would then lead to its personality, because that is what to Kant being a person means. Being a person means being identical with yourself and being conscious of the identity with yourself in all acts of your consciousnness. As an aside, that is why Kant is saying that animals are not persons but things. That is a somewhat infamous statement of his, not related to the paralogisms. He says it in completely different context. It's somewhat infamous because I don't think it was too controversial in his time, but nowadays he often gets blamed for this, and nowadays this is often walked for as a criticism against his moral philosophy, that allegedly Kant is ignorant towards animals and to him they are just things, so animal abuse is fine because they are just things that you can do with whatever you want, which is unfortunate because it means that, of course, lots of people who care about animals or about nature, about the environment, will dismiss Kant and his moral philosophy and will rather base their maybe their activism or their actions on other moral theories. I will go more into what Kant actually says about animals and morality in regards to animals when I get to Kant's moral philosophy. It is actually not the case that he is saying we are allowed to do whatever we want with animals and we are allowed to abuse animals. Not at all. But here I just want to take this opportunity to tell you that, well, when Kant talks about persons and things, you must not you must not understand these words as they may be used in everyday language by the layperson. Rather, they are part of his terminology. So when he's calling animals things, he's not saying that they are just lifeless objects that have no feeling and that don't feel when you abuse them. Not at all. It's simply that he is calling everything in his terminology a thing which is not a person. And a person, again, is only that which is conscious of being identical with itself in all acts of its consciousness and all its representations. So imagine a fly. When a fly flies around in this room, Kant would say it has certain representations. It sees the room, and then it may fly into the other room and have different representations and now sees different things. but it is not conscious of the identity, uh, of its own identity in these different representations. It's not saying I, the fly, who previously saw this and who now sees this, am still the same person, even though my representations changed. What the fly doesn't have, Kant would say, is the apperception. I made I already made my own lecture about what apperception means to Kant. Basically, it is the act of the intellect connecting the various representations as being one subject's representations, and thereby creating that subject, creating an I, an identical person. I mean, that's probably also why the fly, if you sort of wave it away, we all know this. A few seconds later, the fly will come back and fly around at the exact same spot again, because it doesn't really remember that it was waved away once. So, in this sense, the fly is not a person but a thing, which is not to say that the fly has no feelings of pain or pleasure or whatever, or that we can do with the fly whatever we want. In fact, Kant would say that even with an unfeeling thing, we ought not to do whatever we want. But again, this I will get into when I eventually talk about Kant's moral philosophy. Now on to the second paralogism, the one of quality, and that would be the paralogism of simplicity. So this dialectic illusionary argument would claim that the soul is something simple. What Kant means by that is, well, most things, or rather all the objects in the world around us, all the objects in space, appear to us as being composed of several parts. Like my body is made up of lots of cells, and they in turn are made up of lots of atoms and so on. Everything is composed of parts. Well, the soul is taken to be one thing that is not made up of parts, but that is in this sense simple. It is only one. In the language of Leibniz, this is a very important and famous part of Leibniz philosophy, you could call it a monad. So a oneness, a unity, so to say. You can think of it sort of a conscious atom, a thinking atom. Of course, atom here, not in the sense that modern chemistry and physics use the word, because our atoms nowadays, they actually aren't atoms. I mean, they have parts again. They are made up of electrons and protons and neutrons. But rather in the way the ancient philosophers like Democritus were talking of atoms. I mean, the word atom in Greek means that which can't be divided. So the smallest part out of which everything else is composed, but which itself is not composed. And well, a monad then would be a sort of thinking atom. Now, when it comes to this paralogism, you may think, who cares? Like, this may sound like a very abstract and scholastic question, and I mean, maybe one can argue about that. Maybe the metaphysicians can argue whether the soul has parts, or the soul is a simple thing not made up of parts. But one way or another, what does it matter? Well, it seems to matter because in Kant's day, many metaphysicians of the Leibniz-Wolfian school would base their proof for the soul being immortal on this. That's what Kant says. If this paralogism can prove the simplicity of the soul, then just like from the first one, from the identity follows personality, from the simplicity there seems to follow incorruptibility. Because if you think about it, when things are destroyed, it is usually because their parts are taken apart. Like when your body is destroyed, for example, let's say someone cuts your head off, then you die because your head was separated from your body. And even if we are not thinking of something so violent, even if it's a natural, peaceful death, your body is decomposing. The various parts of your body are sort of falling apart, and that is what is causing the end of the body. So, from that, it would seemingly follow that if there is a thing which is not made up of parts, but which is simple, and therefore which can't be divided into parts, then that thing would be indestructible or incorruptible, as Kant puts it. Because after all, substances cannot be destroyed. That is what the physicists say. That is also what Kant proved a priori in the principles of the intellect. I talked about this in my lecture on the schematism and the principles. In the world, substances can only change their state, but they cannot neither be created nor destroyed. So matter or energy in the world can change its state, it can change its place, it can decompose or be composed, but it cannot actually be destroyed. So if the soul is not made up of parts, but is itself a simple part that can't be divided, then that simple part cannot be destroyed, and then the soul is incorruptible. That is the argument that was used before Kant. And with that, it was seemingly possible to prove that the soul, by its nature, has to live on. I mean, that's not what every thinker who in history has believed in an afterlife would agree with. There are many thinkers that claim that by its nature, it is not necessary for the soul to keep existing always. Many thinkers would have claimed the soul can be destroyed and maybe would be destroyed and cease to exist by its nature, and it is only through a miracle of sorts, it is only through God's decision that the soul keeps existing, so it can go to heaven or to hell. Such a thinker then would claim that it is not possible through reason alone, that it is not possible for the mere metaphysician to prove that the soul is immortal, because it is not immortal by its nature. Rather, such a thinker would then claim that the immortality of our soul is part of belief, it's part of faith. It is something that is revealed to us, like in the Bible or the Quran. So we know because God told us that we will live on after death. But in the 18th century, in the Leibniz-Wolfian school, there was this belief that we don't even need God to be assured that our soul will not be destroyed when we die. We can prove God independently, but we can prove the incorruptibility of the soul by its very nature, which is a simple nature, independently of God. So even if there was no God, still we knew from its nature that the soul would exist on. Now, Kant will refute this paralogism like the others will. So he will show that the simplicity of the soul can actually not be proven. But even if it could, Kant says that this is not a good argument to prove that the soul cannot stop being. Because, well, if you think about it, a thing being divided into its parts, that would be a sort of destruction or corruption in a quantitative way. Here you can go back to my lecture on the schematism and the principles of the intellect. And among the principles, I talked about that the first principle, the principle of quantity, is that everything that appears to us as having an extension in space and in time. And sure, if something is extended in space, then I can imagine it being divided. I can imagine it being cut in half, so to say, and in that way destroyed. But that is only a quantitative destruction, and that is not the only possible way of destroying something. Because, as I said in that other lecture, the second principle, the principle of quality, is that every reality in the world, everything that is a quality, has a certain intensity. And Kant says I can imagine the intensity of something decreasing until it is zero. Like I could imagine the intensity of a light, for example, the light being dimmed down, getting darker and darker until there's absolute darkness, until there's no light left. Or I could imagine the saltiness of a dish being lessened and lessened until the food doesn't taste salty at all anymore. And likewise, Kant says the same could be imagined of consciousness. I mean, there are different intensities of consciousness, different degrees of consciousness. I can be more clear in my consciousness, I can be more unclear. Something can be only unconscious. I can be asleep and dreaming. I can be in a coma and completely unconscious. And so there's nothing preventing me from imagining that the soul may be a simple thing, maybe a monad, but its consciousness could decrease in degree until it reaches zero. And the soul, therefore, Kant says, could be destroyed not just by being divided. That is indeed something that can only happen if it is not a simple thing, if it is not a monad. But even if it was a monad, it could be destroyed by fading away. And that is a way of destruction or corruptibility that Leibniz-Wolfian philosophers did not account for. But anyways, on to the third paralogism, the one of relation. When it comes to that, we get the paralogism of substantiality. Right, so the first of the categories of relation was the category of substance and accidents, or subsistence and inheritance and inherence. So everything, I explained that further in the lecture on the table of categories, but everything that exists must exist either as a substance, so as its own thing, so to say, or as an accident, that is as another thing's attribute. And the same therefore must be true of the soul. And by the way, because someone, especially nowadays, might answer, no, doesn't need to be true of the soul. There's also the third option that there simply is no soul. No, that is not really an option, because when Kant says soul, you must not already think of a substance like this spiritual soul that is in our bodies but could also exist independently of our bodies. That the soul is such a thing is exactly what rational psychology is trying to prove. And Kant is showing that it can't prove that. So since this is still in the open, you must not think of the soul like that. Rather, when Kant says soul, you could replace that word here with the Greek word. The Greek word for soul is psyche. It originally means the same thing, but we, of course, use it in another way as we use the word soul now. So when Kant is saying soul, think psyche, or think mind, or think consciousness. That is something which undoubtedly exists in some way or form. I mean, there could not be a psychology, and I'm speaking now of empirical psychology. There could not be a psychology if there was no psyche, right? But now the question is, when it comes to the categories of relation, the question is, what is this psyche, or what is the consciousness or the mind? Is it an accident? That is what materialists would claim, and that is what nowadays is part of the leading worldview, claiming that the soul, the psyche, is sort of an accident of the brain. It is just an attribute of our brain, but the actual substance is the brain. And this third paralogism, on the other hand, tries to prove the opposite. It tries to prove that the soul is not just one of the attributes of our body, or more specifically of a certain part of the body, of the brain, but rather that the soul is its own substance. These are the first three paralogisms, and Kant says if we take them together, so if we take the soul to have identity and therefore personality, if we take the soul to have simplicity and therefore incorruptibility, and if we take the soul to have substantiality, this third paralogism, if it was indeed not a paralogism but a correct syllogism, so if it could indeed prove that the soul is a substance, would also lead us to the immateriality of the soul, Kant says. Because, all the substances around us are material substances. They are made up of matter. They are the substances we can perceive through our outer sense, right? I talked in the lecture on sensuality and the forms of viewing. I talked about how sensuality to Kant is made up of two parts. There's the outer sense, through which we can perceive material things in space, and then there's the inner sense through which we can perceive our own representations, our thoughts and our feelings and sensations and so on. And everything we perceive through the outer sense, if it is a substance, must be a material substance. But the thing is, we don't perceive the soul through the outer sense. We perceive the soul through the inner sense. And the form of viewing of the inner sense is not space. It is only time, but it is not space. I don't perceive my own thoughts or sensations or so on in space. So therefore, if the soul is a substance, but it is not an outer substance in space, it is not a material substance, and therefore it is an immaterial substance. Now, if we take these first three paralogisms, or rather their conclusions, and combine them, so if we go with the soul having identity with itself and therefore personality, if we go with the soul having simplicity and therefore incorruptibility, and if we go with the soul having substantiality and therefore, since it's not a material substance, immateriality, then that would lead us to believing in the spirituality of the soul, Kant says. So that would lead to the conclusion that the soul is a spirit. Because to Kant, that is exactly what a spirit is. A spirit is an immaterial substance which has personality, so which is identical with itself and which is conscious, and which is simple, which can't be divided. So it is important to understand Kant's terminology here, because in today's everyday language, we don't really make that distinction. We don't necessarily make a distinction between the soul in the body and outside of the body. So if you believe in a soul, you will probably say, okay, when I die, my soul leaves my body, and maybe it goes to heaven or to hell, or maybe it is reborn. Kant would say, no, the soul doesn't leave the body, because the moment it does, it stops being a soul. It is then just a spirit. So the spirit is this spiritual being, this consciousness, this immaterial substance. And if the spirit connects with a body, if the spirit is in a body, then it is a soul to Kant. He himself is not quite consistent with that terminology, so he also at times talks about the soul leaving the body and living on and so on. But in general, soul should be understood to mean something like psyche or consciousness or whatever, and therefore the word soul, in the sense Kant uses it, is something that even the materialist, so even someone who nowadays would say, I don't believe in a soul, could agree with, because the word soul as such for Kant leaves open whether the soul is just an attribute of our body or whether it is really its own thing. And a spirit, again, would be, so to say, a soul independent of the body. And what these first three paralogisms try to prove is exactly that our soul, so our psyche, our mind, is indeed a spirit. It has spirituality, and therefore could also potentially exist independently of the body. Well, and then last, we get the paralogism related to modality, and this says that the soul is, so this substance, according to the third paralogism, is in relation to other substances, to other objects that are possible. So it is in relation to possible objects outside of itself. So to the body at first, which is another object different from the soul, outside of the soul, and then of course all the other things surrounding the body. The soul is in relation to possible objects outside of itself. And this, if it could be proven, would prove the animality, Kant says. I hope it's not too confusing, this whole terminology, this all these words derived from Latin. Kant himself, in this part of the Critique of Pure Reason, excuses the use of all these Latin words. It's maybe more striking in German because English is full of Latin words. English, like when in English I say simplicity of the soul, it maybe doesn't sound so unusual because simple is a normal English word, but in German the word for simple would be einfach. But Kant doesn't say Einfachheit der Seele, he says Simplizität der Seele. So he uses these Latin words, but he excuses himself and he says that being precise and using the old scholastic terminology and therefore being clear about what exactly he means is more important than writing in a beautiful style for him. This last paralogism would prove the animality. What that means is, of course, not us being animals. Rather, you have to remember that in Latin, anima is exactly the word for soul. And anima is that in a being, be it a human being or an animal, which animates it, so which gives life to it. I mean, that is where we take the word animation from. And of course also the word animal. I mean, an animal is called an animal because it is not lifeless like a stone just lying around, but rather it has an anima, a soul, which animates it, which gives life to it, which makes it walk around. So if the soul is indeed in relation to other possible objects outside of it, namely the body at first, then it is that which gives life to us, which animates us. And finally, Kant says, if we take this animality and combine it with the spirituality, again, spirituality we get from the combination of the first three characteristics. So the combination of identity, simplicity, and substantiality. If we combine this spirituality with animality, we get the immortality of the soul. And that is, after all, the main idea that rational psychology is after. If the soul is that which animates the body, which gives life to the body, but is at the same time a spirit, not simply part of the body, not simply some sort of life force that would die together with the body, but rather it is a spirit which only temporarily connects with the body and gives life to the body, but which itself is independent of the body because it is immaterial, and which also, being a simple being, is incorruptible, so it cannot die together with the body because it is only made up of one part, not of several that could decompose. Then the soul would be immortal. Then we could be assured that we will live on after the death of our body. These are the four paralogisms, or rather, these are their conclusions. I mean, I didn't go into the actual paralogisms, but this is what they are trying to prove. But what does Kant have to say about these paralogisms? Why they are wrong? Again, a paralogism would mean formally wrong argument. How can an argument be formally wrong? Well, the syllogism, as I already said, is made up of a major and a minor, and from these two premises it draws the conclusion. Now, one mistake you can make, like again, you can say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, one mistake you could make is taking the words, taking the subject more precisely, in the major and the minor in a different sense. I mean, I can only subsume the minor under the major because man, when I talk about Socrates being a man, here means the same thing as man in the major. When I say all men are mortal, it means human being. But now imagine if I said a virgin is sexless as my major, and then as my minor I said being male or being female is a sex, and then I do the conclusion, therefore virgins are neither male nor female. That is obviously a wrong conclusion, and the error here is that both the major and the minor use the word sex, but they use it in a different sense. When I say a virgin is sexless, I'm talking about sex in the sense of sexual intercourse. And when I talk about male and female being sexes, I talk about sex in the sense of gender. So this leads to a confusion and therefore to a wrong conclusion. And that is exactly what is happening here. In the four paralogisms, the error, Kant says, is always the same. The error is that soul is really used in a different way in the major and the minor. Because we have two different concepts of the soul or of the I. Here I remind you of my lecture on the apperception. And if you haven't, I recommend watching that one first. Otherwise, the following might be hard to follow. The apperception, I said, was the act of connecting our various representations into being the representations of one subject, and therefore the apperception is what makes that subject. And in that lecture I explained how, well, we have two different kinds of apperceptions, and therefore in a sense we have two different eyes. We have on the one hand the empirical apperception, which gives us the empirical eye, which gives us the homo phenomenon. So that is I in the way I appear to myself, in the way I find myself through my inner sense, through the thoughts and feelings and desires and so on that I perceive in myself. So that would be the I in the sense of my psyche, my mind. That is the I that empirical psychology deals with. And on the other hand, I have transcendental apperception, which gives me a transcendental I, which gives me the homo noumenon. And that is the I not that appears to me. That is not I in the way I affect myself through my representations, but rather that is I in the way I act, I in the way I think. This I, Kant says, is nothing but the logical subject to all our thinking. Thinking simply works in this way that to every object being thought, we need a subject doing the thinking. And we can't think of an object without, at least unconsciously, thinking the subject. There's this famous statement of Kant that the I must be able to accompany all my representations. So I must be able to always say, I am the one thinking this, I am the one seeing this, I am the one feeling this. And this I, this logical function of the subject to the object, that is what transcendental apperception gives us. But as I said in that other lecture on apperception, we can't really know anything about this I, apart from it being this logical function. We can't get to the I in itself no more than we can get to the thing in itself. We can only get to the I as it appears to us. Like we can only get to the thing as it appears to us. So we can only get to the empirical I. And this is exactly what is important to Kant's refutation of the paralogisms. Because they are, or rather the things they try to prove, they are true when it comes to this transcendental I. And in this case, they are simply analytic judgments. They are not synthetic, they don't expand our knowledge, but rather they only explain what it is we are thinking when we are saying I, when we are thinking of a subject. I mean, if I just analyze what it means to say I, then I find, yes, this includes at first identity, like the paralogism of quantity claims. It includes identity and therefore personality, because that's what the word I means, right? It means when I say I now have this thought, and then later I say I now have this other thought, and in both times I say I, then I'm saying I, the thinking subject who first thought this, am identical with the thinking subject who is now thinking this. I am one and the same person. If I wasn't, if the person thinking this one thought and the person thinking this other thought were not identical, I would not call both of them I. I would say I and you, for example. I would say this is my thought, but this is something I didn't think. This is something that was thought by someone else. Likewise, the simplicity. Again, we can simply analyze what I means, and we will find that indeed we take ourselves to be simple, to not be made up of parts. Now, of course, I can, if I think further and investigate further, I can come to the belief that this I of mine is somehow created by my brain. And of course, the brain has several parts. But in the I as such, if I simply analyze what it means to say I, there's no multiplicity. I mean, I'm not saying there are several persons in me. I'm not saying this thought of mine was thought by the left part of my eye, and this thought of mine was thought by the right part of my eye, or whatever. But rather, I'm saying there's simply the I. If I had the feeling that it was made up of several parts, then I would probably have a split personality. But in general, the way it feels for us, so to say, is that we are a simple thing. And even if you believe that in truth you aren't, in truth you are your brain, and of course your brain has several parts, that is something you could only arrive at through observations, through experiment, and so on. But even so, it is not what you actually feel, so to say, in your thinking. And I mean, this goes back to what I said in the previous lecture, in the lecture on what is dialectic. there I said that Kant claims the dialectic of reason creates an illusion which can be shown to be an illusion, so that we don't believe in it anymore. But even then, the illusion doesn't stop. I said in that lecture it can be compared to the illusion that Copernicus destroyed, the illusion of the sun revolving around the earth. We now know it isn't so, but if we look at the sky over the course of the day, it still seems as if the sun was moving across the sky. And likewise, we may know that, or believe to know, that the soul, that our psyche is created by the brain and therefore by something which has several parts. But even so, the illusion in our thinking, in our consciousness, that our consciousness is really one thing, one simple thing, which doesn't have parts, this illusion still remains. And again, it is simply something we can analyze out of the concept of what an I is. Likewise, the substantiality. I take myself to be a substance. I don't, when I say I don't take myself to be just an attribute of another thing, to be just a predicate, but rather to be my own independent thing. And again, you may come to the belief that this is not so, that your consciousness, really is just an attribute of your brain. But even so, that is not that's not going to make the illusion go away. You will still go through life feeling as if your I was its own thing, and we actually feel more like the I has a body rather than, even if our natural science may tell us so, rather than feeling like our body has an I. I mean, you will keep talking, even if you're a materialist who says there is no soul, it's all just happening in the brain. You will still say not the brain is thinking this or that, but rather I am thinking this or that. You will still say not my brain is now doing this, but rather you will say I am now doing this. You will not say my brain has, for example, an extroverted I, just like you may say I have brown eyes, but rather you will say I am extroverted. I am an extrovert. So again, if we analyze what the word I means means I am the subject. The thoughts are my predicates. So yes, analytically, this logical I is indeed a substance and not an accident. And likewise with the last of the attributes, we indeed think of ourselves as being in relation to possible objects that possibly exist outside of ourselves. I mean, that is exactly what thinking is. Thinking is this relation between subject and object. There's a subject thinking the object. And therefore, in thinking, there is a separation between the subject and the object. So when you say I, you are saying I am the subject who is having these thoughts, who is having this cognition, and everything else is not I, is an object independent of I. And again, even if you say that your I is created by your brain, in your thinking, you will still sort of say the opposite. You will say, for example, when you do research and experiments on the brain, you will still say, I am thinking of my brain. I am looking at my brain. As if I, the subject of thinking, and the brain as an object being thought about, were two different entities. So again, identity, simplicity, substantiality, and being in relation to possible objects outside of yourself, all of that is simply what it means to be an I in the logical sense. So all of that can be analyzed out of the I. But now we want to not just analyze what it means to be an I, to be in the subject and thinking, but rather rational psychology tries to do synthetic judgments. I mean, the paralogisms, like all syllogisms, are synthetic. They are synthesizing two premises, a major and a minor, into a new conclusion. And we want to expand our knowledge. After all, we try to find out what is this I of ours, independently of its experiencing, of its thinking in this life of ours. We want to prove that this I of ours is a spirit which eventually can leave the body and live on. So here we are trying to do synthetic judgments a priori. And as Kant shows, and as I talked about in previous lectures, synthetic judgments a priori are only possible if they are based on viewing. Now, it doesn't have to be empirical viewing, then they would be synthetic judgments a posteriori. It can be pure viewing, so they can be based just on pure time and space, not on me experiencing a specific thing in time and space. But they still need to be based on viewing. If I just synthesize concepts in thinking alone without being connected to any viewing, I can't know if I'm really thinking of something or of nothing. My thoughts are empty then, and I don't know if there's any reality to them. I need to do my synthesis in viewing. But now the problem arises that we have no viewing, no intuition of the soul. I can think of this I, this logical subject in all of the thinking, but I cannot experience it. Or rather, the only viewing I have of myself is that through the inner sense. But here I'm not viewing myself as I am in itself. I'm not viewing myself as maybe a spiritual soul, but rather I am only viewing myself as I appear in this life, in this world of experience, which doesn't tell me anything about what I am actually, independently of the thoughts and feelings and so on through which I appear to myself. I mean, maybe I'm a spirit having these thoughts and feelings, but I can't see this spirituality of mine. I can only see, so to say, I can only perceive these thoughts and feelings that I have. So I only perceive myself as I appear in this life, in this body, and through that I cannot know what I may be, or if I even can be, independent of that body. So, and this is what leads to the error in all four of these paralogisms. They all confuse the unity in thinking. So for thinking, it is indeed necessary to have this unified subject, this synthetic unity of a perception. But all the paralogisms confuse this unity in thinking with the unity of that thing which is doing that thinking. And all I can say is that in thinking, and as long as I am thinking, I must have these four qualities that the paralogisms try to prove. But that doesn't show me that once my thinking or once my experiencing of this sensual world may stop, I will still retain these qualities. So yes, as long as I am thinking, I will be identical with myself. I will be a person. Because that is what it means, that I am thinking, that I am saying these thoughts are mine. They are all belonging to the same I. But I don't know if maybe eventually this thinking of mine will end, and with that I will also cease to be identical with myself. Or instead of the first, take the fourth paralogism. You can say that yes, in thinking, as long as you think, there must be this subject-object divide. And therefore there must be, to put it with Fichte, an I and a not I. But that doesn't prove that the I is really something else than the not I. And it doesn't prove that if my thinking or if my experiencing of this particular not I, of this sensual world, ever stops, I, as something separate from this not I, will still keep existing. So basically, in all four paralogisms, the error is the same. The error is that the major is making a statement about things in general, and therefore also the empirical I, but the minor is only talking through analytic judgments about the transcendental I. So, for example, in the first paralogism, the argument will be all the things, and note this, all the things, all the objects, which at all times are conscious of the identity of themselves with themselves in all their acts of consciousness, all such things are persons, have personality. And then the minor says, I am conscious at all times of being identical with myself. Therefore, that would be the conclusion. Therefore, I have personality. That sounds like a correct and convincing argument at first. But the confusion is that the major talks about things in general, about objects, which are conscious of being identical with themselves. And therefore, if there was such an object that was conscious of its identity, it would be a person. And then the minor is not actually talking about an object which is always conscious of its identity, but rather it's saying I as a subject have this consciousness of my identity. Yes, as a subject I do have this consciousness because, again, analytically that is simply what being a subject means. But it doesn't mean that I as an object, so the thing which is, so to say, having this subjectivity, is also identical with itself and is also therefore a person. I can't draw this conclusion. So, as Kant says, the error in all the paralogisms is that we can abstract from the empirical conditions of our thinking. So, I can, for example, abstract from my brain, and I can even say, I think about my brain as if I was separate from that brain. And the error is we take this ability to abstract from the empirical conditions of our thinking to be knowledge of our truly being independent of these empirical conditions. But this is not something that follows. So what Kant is saying is consciousness is nothing but form. It is a certain form of having representations, of perceiving things, of thinking of things, in this form of subjectivity, in this form of the I, of saying, I am the one who is having these representations. And we can now analyze this form. And yes, as a form, consciousness contains identity, simplicity, substantiality, and thinking as a subject in relation to objects. That is indeed the form of consciousness. And that is all true through analytic judgments. But from the form that consciousness has in consciousness to itself, we can't draw a conclusion concerning the thing, so the material, the content, which has this form. Maybe it is a soul which is identical with this form, or maybe it is a brain which creates this form in consciousness, but which itself has a completely different form, which itself is not always identical with itself, always simple, always its own substance, always a subject disconnected from other objects. We can't conclude from the form of our consciousness that we know analytically. We can't draw from that a synthetic judgment about the actual content of the object which is having this consciousness. And that is Kant's conclusion to these four paralogisms, and therefore his refutation of rational psychology as it existed in his day. Basically, we can make these statements about ourselves as thinking subjects, but only as long as we are thinking subjects. And we only know to be thinking subjects from experience. We don't know that we will keep being thinking subjects beyond experience. So I can say that as long as I am thinking, it is indeed necessary that I am identical with myself, or that I am simple and not made up of several parts, because that is what it means that I am thinking. But I cannot say that it is in itself necessary that I am identical or simple. Maybe when I die, my thinking will stop, and therefore me, since consciousness stops, me perceiving myself in this form will stop, and maybe I will just die and be gone then. With that, I could end this lecture and get to the conclusion, get to what Kant now says about rational psychology and its role in general. But before I do that, I want to address two important topics that fit here in this lecture. And they are both related to the fourth paralogism, the one of modality, the one claiming the soul is in relation to possible objects outside of it. This opinion versus two issues that can be taken to be two of the main problems of modern philosophy since Descartes. You can say that Descartes, with his cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, founded modern philosophy, and since then philosophers have wrestled with two problems. I mean, it's not that these problems didn't exist at all previously. You couldn't find them in a way before Descartes. You could find them even in antiquity, but they have not been so prominent, or thinkers have not been so conscious of the potential for these problems to arise. But since Descartes, you can say that these two problems have been two of the main problems of all philosophy, at least all theoretical philosophy. And these are the problems of empirical idealism and the body-soul problem. And so I want to take this opportunity, since I'm talking about rational psychology and about the soul and what Kant says about that, to also explain what Kant says about these two problems. First, empirical idealism. Empirical idealism, as I already mentioned in the lecture on transcendental idealism, and I recommend again watching that lecture first. Empirical idealism would be the opinion that the things outside of you, they are not real, they are only ideal, meaning they are only thoughts, they are only existing in your consciousness, but not independently of you. So the whole world is just a dream or a hallucination, really. This empirical idealism Kant identifies with thinkers such as Descartes or Berkeley. So in Descartes' case, he talks of problematic idealism because he is aware that this was not Descartes' actual opinion. So Descartes wasn't actually thinking that the world doesn't exist and it's just his imagination. But for Descartes, it was a problem he wrestled with. The possibility of thinking that and how we could disprove that. In the case of Berkeley, Kant talks of dogmatic idealism because he says this was really the opinion that Berkeley's philosophy upholds. But anyways, Kant is trying to deal with and to disprove that empirical idealism. And it is important to stress that because many people who don't understand transcendental idealism read Kant as if he was an empirical idealist. That happened even in his own day, and he had to refute that, which is actually one of the main reasons why he rewrote certain passages in the second edition to the Critique of Pure Reason. And it is especially the passage on the rational psychology and the paralogisms, which he thoroughly rewrote to better refute empirical idealism and show that this is not his position. Because Kant, after all, is a transcendental idealist, and as he puts it, transcendental idealism means empirical realism. So he is saying that the empirical objects, the things we experience, they are real. But, so that is the empirical realism, but now comes the transcendental idealism, but they are real as objects that appear to us, as our representations. They are not real as things in themselves. Rather, the things in themselves, since they don't appear to us, are things that we don't know. So, how does Kant refute empirical idealism? Well, he says that for change, there always needs to be something which persists and which is unchanging. I already mentioned that in a previous lecture, and there I gave the example, imagine you are on a boat floating on the ocean. How do you know that the boat is not standing still? How do you know that it is drifting further away? If there were the stars on the sky, or if there was a shore at the horizon, then you could tell that there's movement. But if there's just nothing, just vast blue sky and vast blue ocean, then how would you know that there's movement? Or likewise, how do we know that the Earth moves? We can say that in relation to another object like the sun, which is unmoving. I mean, the sun is also moving, but in relation to the Earth, we can take it to be unmoving. But now imagine if the Earth was the only thing in the whole universe. How could we say whether the Earth is stationary or whether the Earth is moving? It would not make any sense to even speak of movement if there's just one object. As soon as there's a second object, then we could say, okay, the Earth has this distance to the second object, and now the distance is closing or the distance is increasing. So obviously the Earth is moving closer or is moving further away. But the thing is, in order for change to happen, or rather for change, for movement to be perceived, we need to see it in relation to something unchanging. That is what Kant is saying. That would also be important in regards to a philosophy like that of the pre-Socratic Heraclitus, who famously said that everything is in flow, who famously said that a man can't step twice into the same river because he would not be the same man and it would not be the same river anymore. To this, Kant would not completely disagree with it, because he would always follow his sympathetic method, about which I also already gave a lecture. He would always try, that is, to find the partial truth even in error. And so he would probably say that Heraclitus, or Nietzsche, to whom Heraclitus was very important, and who would also sort of agree with Heraclitus that everything is in flow, Kant would say that they are correct insofar as it comes to the empirical. The world as we observe it is indeed in constant flux and change. But Kant would say that in order for there to be change and for us to be able to perceive it, there must be something which is changing, or rather on which this change is happening, and which therefore remains the same. And I talked about this in the lecture on the schematism and the principles. This is one of the principles of relation, I said, that the substance always remains the same, and it is only the accidents, so the states of the substance, which are changing. Now, why is that important to empirical idealism? Well, Kant says in our consciousness we have representations that are changing, right? I now have this thought, then I have that thought, I have this feeling, then I have that feeling, and also all my representations of the world, which according to the empirical idealist doesn't really exist. So the representations are just in my consciousness, they are just sort of hallucinations. They are ever changing too. Well, Kant says this would not be possible if there wasn't actually a thing which was unchanging. So what he is saying is, I can only be conscious if outside of me there is a thing to which I'm somehow related and to which my consciousness relates, and which as a thing, it may change its states, but as a thing remains the same. Without that to sort of hold on to in my thinking, my own thinking could not happen. Now, this argument of Kant's is correct, basically. So it is a bit unclear and convoluted whenever he talks about it, which is probably because he himself had not reached full clarity about it. Fichte later would put it in way more clear and way more simple terms, and would show that, well, yeah, there cannot be an I without a not I. There cannot be a subject without an object. The subject could not, if it had no object and no your own baseless imaginations are not an object. You could not have them if there was not something they were based on. Such a subject could not even think of itself as a subject. But the problem with Kant is, and with Kant's argument, and probably one reason why the argument is so unclear and convoluted when he talks about this, is that Kant seems not completely sure what he is trying to prove here. Because, as Fichte would later point out, this only proves the existence of the empirical objects, of the phenomena, of these things that appear to us. They really do need to exist. Otherwise, I couldn't exist either. Otherwise, I couldn't think of them. And that is really all we need to prove to refute empirical idealism, because the opposite of empirical idealism is empirical realism, saying that the empirical objects really do exist. They are not imaginations, they are not dreams. But it seems that Kant here is trying to actually prove more than just that. It seems that he's trying to prove the existence of the things in themselves. And that is simply not consistent with transcendental idealism. Actual transcendental idealism, Fichte would later be more consistent here, doesn't need the things in themselves, and they can't be proven, and they don't need to be proven to refute empirical idealism. But moving on to the second problem, the body-soul problem. That is a very famous problem in philosophy. It is one that is still discussed to this day, mainly in what is called philosophy of mind, which is most prominent in the English-speaking world, but also influential beyond that. This so-called philosophy of mind is quite pathetic and quite ridiculous, because it is basically very superficial, and it is basically based on complete ignorance toward the actual history of philosophy, because the body-soul problem has been solved by transcendental idealism. I mean, it's simply not a problem anymore. So the only reason why it is still treated as one is because these people at the academy, there are lots who are simply ignorant towards transcendental idealism. But first off, what is the body-soul problem? Well, Descartes had identified two different kinds of substances. He called them res cogitans, so thinking thing, and res extensa, so extended thing, soul and body. So these two substances are of completely different quality. The soul, the mind, the I, consciousness, is something which thinks, but which has no spatial extension. And bodies, material bodies, they are extended in space, but they don't think. And now the question is, how can they be connected? So how is it possible that if my soul wants to lift the arm, my arm actually is lifted? Or in the other way, how is it possible that when there's a red thing in front of my eyes, or I get stabbed, my soul actually perceives the redness or actually feels the pain? How does that work? And it's not hard to explain how an object can affect another object of the same kind. So how one material body can affect another material body by touching it. So of course I can say, when I see, let's say, a red object, there is light going against that object. being reflected by that object, falling into my eyes. Then there is my nerve going from the eye to the brain. All of that makes sense. But then there is a point in that chain of cause and effect where there is a gap. How does this impulse get from my brain into my consciousness? How does it produce this sensation of redness? That is the question here. You can maybe imagine a ghost playing domino. It is not hard to understand how when the first piece falls down and it hits the second one, the second falls down, and then the third falls down, being hit by the second, and so on. And I can imagine a chain of dominoes that is made up of 1,000,000 pieces. No problem. But how can the first domino be pushed over by a ghost whose hand would just pass right through it? Or how can the last domino fall down and fall against the ghost? And how can the ghost feel it if the domino falls right through it? So that is basically the body-soul problem. And our very shallow present tries to mainly just get around that problem by simply claiming that our consciousness is not the last link in the chain, and therefore we don't need to explain how we get from the link before to the last link, but rather the now reigning ideology claims that the brain is the last link in the chain. And then, of course, we can explain how the light gets from the object into the eye, and the impulse gets from the eye into the brain, and it gets processed in the brain. And so we just deny the last link in the chain, and then we don't have to explain how the last link is linked to the previous links. But I mean, that's simply obviously wrong. I mean, the brain is obviously not the last link in the chain. The question remains why, when something is happening in the brain, when there are electric currents and chemical processes in the brain, why does that lead to consciousness? Why is it felt or seen? I mean, there are things happening in other people's brain, and I am not conscious of what they are seeing. I'm only conscious of what I am seeing. How come? Where is this I of mine? So materialism, the now reigning ideology, really has no answer to that. It just refuses to give an answer and just tries to pretend no answer is needed to get around this. But what does Kant say about this problem? And here he is probably the most inconsistent in his theoretical philosophy. Or at least it's one of the places where he's most inconsistent. What Kant is claiming is that there are only two possible ways to solve this, which in turn both have two variants. First, there is what Kant calls harmonism. So harmonism would be claiming that there is no connection between the body and the soul, but they are in harmony. So they are doing the same thing at the same time, but not because one of them is causing the other to do it. The domino would fall down in the moment the ghost is reaching for it with its hand, but not because the ghost reached for it, but because of another reason. This general theory of harmony, as I said, can have two variants. One would be occasionalism, which is a theory that, based on Descartes, was held by the French philosopher Malebranche. And basically, occasionalism says that in each instance, it is God who makes my body do what the soul wants, and who makes my soul feel what the body feels, or what happens to the body. So basically, the claim here is that when I want to lift my arm, the soul itself doesn't have the power to lift the arm. But God, being all knowing, knows that I want to lift my arm in that second. And being all powerful, he also can lift my arm for me. So it is actually God lifting my arm in the moment I want to lift my arm. Or the other way around, when there's a red object in front of my eyes, that redness could not be perceived by my soul directly, but God, knowing that my body is currently looking at something red, creates this sensation of redness in my consciousness. So that's why it's called occasionalism, because at the occasion of me wanting something, God makes my body do it. At the occasion of something happening to my body, God makes me feel it. This theory, however, is not really satisfying. It would, as Leibniz criticized, it would require constant miracles, which, I mean, would not be impossible for God. If he's all powerful, then really there should be no reason why he couldn't do this in each second for billions of people at the same time, causing endless miracles. But Leibniz said that it simply doesn't befit the dignity of God to have to do that. And I mean, if you think about it, it would mean that God really does everything for us. That it means that even after I went to the toilet, when I wipe my ass, or even when I masturbate, it's really God moving my hand for me. That doesn't seem to befit God's dignity. Which is why, according to Kant, there is another form of harmonism apart from occasionalism, and that is what he calls pre-stabilism. That is a very famous part of Leibniz philosophy, the claim of a pre-stabilized harmony. Meaning that God created the world of the bodies, so the physical universe, and God created the souls in a way to work in a harmonious manner, but without God, so to say, having to stand at the side and having to do every little action for us, but rather the actions are happening by themselves, simply because God once at the start created things that way. So you can imagine someone creating two clocks, and now the two clocks will work in the same way at the same time. They will both, for example, show 12 o'clock at the same time. But not because one clock is affecting the other. They are completely independent of each other, simply working in harmony. But in theory, one clock could break and stand still, and the other would not even feel it and would just go on. And the reason they are always showing the same time in the same moment is not because the person who made the clock is standing next to both clocks and in each second pushing the clock a little further, but rather the reason is because the same person originally created the clocks and made them start, and now the clocks are working independently of their maker. This second form of harmonism, this belief in a pre-stabilized harmony, would mean that the physical world is running its course according to physical laws, and basically from the moment it was created. So you could say from the Big Bang. So of course Leibniz didn't talk about a Big Bang yet, but from the Big Bang, the laws of nature make it absolutely necessary that right now in this second my body lifts its arm. It's not because my soul wants to lift the arm, but rather it is because of everything that happened in nature before for billions of years, that now my body has to lift the arm. But at the same time that the body has to lift the arm because of natural law, the soul actually wants to lift the arm. And God, in his all-knowingness and almightiness, made sure that this is the case, that the world is created in such a way that it has to always do the things that the souls want in the right moment. This theory of pre-stabilized harmony may seem more elegant than the theory of occasionalism. But actually, Kant says that if you have to be a harmonist, he isn't. He disagrees with harmonism completely. But if you have to be one, it's better to go with occasionalism, because actually Leibniz may think that his explanation is more elegant, but it actually requires an even bigger miracle and is actually even less understandable for us, how it would be possible for the physical world of the bodies and for the souls to both run their course independently from each other, but still in harmony. It's simply a claim Leibniz makes, but we can't possibly understand how this could be. That is why Kant is against harmonism, and he goes with the second possible explanation, which he calls influxionism. So this is the belief in what is called in the terminology of philosophy an influxus physicus. So a physical influx. It simply means that the soul and the body somehow influence each other. Somehow the soul is connected with the body. Somehow the body is connected with the soul. There is not just a harmony despite them being disconnected, but no, they really do relate to each other as cause and effect. Now, of course, you could ask, how could such a physical influx be possible? Or rather, you could say, isn't the whole body-soul problem basically based on the realization that it is not possible for two such different substances as a sinking substance and an extended substance to have a direct influence on each other? Isn't the whole harmonism, no matter if it's occasionalism or pre-stabilism, isn't the whole harmonism trying to find some sort of explanation precisely because a direct influx is not possible? Well, yes, Kant says, but this is only true as long as you take the soul and the body to be two substances that are completely different in quality. And this is where his transcendental idealism, about which I already gave its own lecture, this is where his transcendental idealism comes into play. Because he's saying, well, the body, after all, is just an appearance. It's just a phenomenon. So it appears to me that I have a body which is extended in space. This is how I am affected by the body. This is, so to say, the image that reaches my consciousness of this thing. But the thing in itself, which affects me, which causes this image of a body extended in space, the thing in itself is not an extended body, because space is just one of my forms of viewing. I view everything that I perceive through my outer sense in space, but as a thing in itself, independent of my consciousness, it's not spatially extended. So therefore, what Kant is saying is that as things in themselves, the body and the soul could be of the same kind. And then it wouldn't be so miraculous anymore that they can affect each other. Just like two bodies, since they are of the same kind, since they are both extended, can affect each other. So Kant's claim is basically that this problem only exists as long as we take the body and the soul to be things in themselves, and as things in themselves to be different. So it only exists for dogmatic philosophy. But if we are transcendental idealists and we say that soul and body only appear to us as very different things, but in truth actually are things of the same kind, then there is no problem anymore. This influxionism again has two variants, as Kant says, because you can either believe in an influxus originarius, so an original influx, or in influxus derivativus, so a derived influx. The first belief would be the belief that the soul and the body are directly influencing each other with nothing in between. And this Kant disagrees with, because he says this is not possible, or rather we could not understand how this could be possible. If two things are to somehow influence each other, there needs to be a third, there needs to be a medium through which they influence each other, through which this influx is happening, Kant says. That is why he, out of these four possible explanations, why he subscribes to the influxus physicus derivativus. Now, maybe you don't understand this at first. Maybe you will say, wait a minute, of course it's possible for things to influence each other without a third, without a medium. I mean, that's what's happening in the world of the bodies, right? If one piece of domino pushes the other piece over, or if one billiard ball pushes the other and makes the second ball roll away, there is no third thing here, right? In fact, there is, Kant would say, and that is space. They, two extended bodies, can only influence each other through space, because they are in the same space. And then if one gets into actually the same point in space as the other, then it touches the other, and then it pushes the other out of that space. But if two things were not in the same space, two bodies, they could not influence each other. So think of a parallel universe. The things there in that space could not touch the things here in this space. What Kant is saying there is that in order for two things to influence each other, they must be in some sort of community with each other. They must be part of the same world. And in order for them to be part of the same world, there must be something which, well, makes them the same world, which connects all the things of that world. And that, when it comes to the bodies, is space, of course. But now, the claim is that the body and the soul are influencing each other as things in themselves. And as things in themselves, they are not in space. Because again, and I explained that further in my lecture on sensuality and the forms of viewing, again, space, according to Kant, is just the way in which we view things, but not the way things in themselves are. So, what is that third? What is that medium which connects these two things in themselves then? Kant says it's God. Just like space makes the appearances be in one world because they are all in the same space, God makes the things in themselves be in one world because they are all in God. God, so the world in itself, you don't have to imagine it as things, even if they are spiritual, non-material things, existing somewhere independently of God, and then there's God somewhere else independently of them. But rather, the way Kant thinks of it, there's only God, and all the things in themselves are in God. That is what God being present in all things means. It's of course not a spatial presence. He's not locally present in all things, because then God would have to be made up of several parts, and he would not be present in anything completely, but only with different parts of his. But rather it's a virtual presence, Kant says. Maybe you should rather say not God is present in the things, but the things are present in God. Because the way Kant thinks of it, all things in themselves are in God's intellect. And God's intellect is not discursive like ours, but intuitive. So God has an intellectual viewing. He views things as they are in themselves, and he views them in himself, because they are, so to say, his own viewing. And that means that, according to Kant, the influxus physicus is possible in the supersensual realm, because just like in the physical realm, things can touch because they are in the same space. There, things in themselves can influence each other because they are both in God. This is interesting, I think, because it means, and I already mentioned that in my lecture on sensuality and the forms of viewing, it means that Kant seems to subscribe to a sort of Spinozism, to a sort of pantheism. Pantheism being the belief that everything is God, or that God is everything. Kant says a few times that space is the phenomenon of God's omnipresence. So, after all, he says that all the things that appear to us are phenomena and not noumena. So they are the things not as they are, but as we perceive them, as they affect us. And we can't help but perceiving things in space. That's how they appear to us. Well, it seems that Kant is of the opinion that, of course, we also can't see God as he is in himself, but this space, which is our form of viewing, our form of viewing all the things, this space is itself also an appearance, and it is the appearance of God's omnipresence, of God being present in everything. That appears to us as everything being in space. So I find this quite interesting because usually there are no connections drawn between Kant and Spinoza. Usually they are taken to have quite different opinions, and Kant himself, who didn't deal with Spinoza much, he doesn't seem to have really studied him. And Kant himself, in a few notes, disagrees with Spinoza and sort of tries to refute Spinoza, and Kant would not have spoken of himself as a pantheist. He would have called himself a theist. But it seems to me that even if maybe he was not totally conscious of it himself and didn't completely reflect on it himself, Kant does believe in a sort of pantheism. But of course, the difference to Spinoza would be that Kant is not a dogmatic philosopher, but a transcendental idealist instead of a transcendental realist. So while Spinoza would say the world that appears to us is the world in itself, and that world is God, Kant would say, no, that world which appears to us is just an appearance. And it is not God, but it is apparently the appearance of God. And the world in itself, here we can really say everything is God, or at least everything is in God. But anyways, I wanted to talk about this first because the body-soul problem is an important question in philosophy, and since I want to give an overview of Kant's whole philosophy and everything he said, I had to address what he says about this important problem. And also because I find it interesting and worth mentioning and stressing that Kant seems to have a sort of transcendental idealistic pantheism that he believes in. And that is something you usually don't find mentioned because it's not very prominent in Kant. You can hardly find it in his works, a bit more in some notes or lectures, but even then it's more of a few side notes that you have to interpret. Again, Kant himself wouldn't have called himself a pantheist. And that's why even lots of experts on Kant will not catch up on this, this unconscious pantheism of his. But nonetheless, it must be said that this whole argumentation is kind of weak and inconsistent. And this is not really Kant at his strongest, because what he says is, there are only these four possible solutions to the body-soul problem. These two forms of harmonism and these two forms of inflectionism. And I mean, if we overlook the whole thing once more, then we can say, okay, that means you can either believe that there is no direct connection between body and soul. They just happen to do the same things at the same time, but not because of each other. Or you can believe there is a direct connection between body and soul. And then if you go a level below that, you can note a sort of symmetry, because in both positions, you can basically say every instance of body and soul being in tune with each other happens because of God. Or you can basically say it happens without God's help. So the pre-stabilized harmony would claim that it happens without God's help. I mean, God is the one who stabilized it in the first place, but after that he can sort of step aside and let things just run their course. And likewise, the influxus physicus originarius would also say that God isn't needed for soul and body to influence each other. And on the other hand, occasionalism and also the influxus physicus derivativus would mean that each instance does require God. Either God to actually sort of move our body for us and to actually create the representations in our soul, or God being less active and more sort of passive, being the medium through which soul and body influence each other. And maybe that also makes it more clear why Kant, when it comes to harmonism, even though he disagrees with harmonism as a whole, he is actually more partial to Malebranche than he is to Leibniz, because the theory of occasionalism is actually closer in a way to Kant's own derived physical influx than the theory of pre-stabilism. But anyways, this whole claim that these are the only four possible explanations is actually based on the premise that you have dualism, so that there really is a body and a soul, two different entities, two different substances, and now you need to explain how they are connected. And then, okay, then maybe these really are the only four possible explanations. Either you can say they are not connected, they just happen to be in harmony, or you can say they are somehow connected. But apart from dualism, there's of course also the possibility to solve this problem through monism. So through saying they actually aren't two different substances. And that is what materialism tries to do, saying there is no soul, there is just a body, there is just our brain. But of course, materialism fails and will always fail because, well, we simply do have consciousness, and consciousness as such simply is not material. You can claim that it comes and is caused by the material, but you cannot just deny that it is its own thing, which is not material. And so if you want to go with a materialist explanation, you have to be a dualist, whether you like it or not, and you have to explain how out of this one thing, this extended material, this completely other thing, this thinking consciousness, comes into being. But there's of course the other possible route, and that is idealism. And I mean, that should be Kant's solution, because he is the founder of transcendental idealism. And yet it is only the solution that Fichte would completely embrace. Fichte would say there is no need to think of body and soul as two different things, and then therefore to explain their connection, but they are one and the same. They are both I, and I appear to myself through the outer sense as a body in space, and I appear to myself through the inner sense as a consciousness thinking in time. But that is really one and the same I, appearing in two different forms of viewing. There's no need to assume that there are two different objects behind these appearances. So Fichte would actually, in a way, agree with the materialist, and in a more radical and fundamental and consistent way than the materialist can ever do. Fichte would say, I don't have a body, as if my soul was this independent spiritual being and then dresses in the body like in a piece of clothes. And then of course you would have to explain, how can a ghost, how can a spirit dress in clothes? How come these clothes are not just passing through his immaterial body and falling to the ground? But no, more consistently than any materialist, Fichte says, I don't have a body, I am my body. And I am my brain. And this is not an object different from me. This is me. Me appearing in space. And this should be Kant's explanation too. That would be the most consistent. And it even is an explanation that is mentioned in the Critique of Pure Reason as a possible explanation. So many readers of Kant, and not just a purely casual reader, but even many people who read lots of Kant works, may not realize just how inconsistent Kant here is, because this whole talk of harmonism and inflectionism you won't really find in his published books or essays. You will find rather in his notes and in his lectures. But there you will find it a lot, even in those that are from the time after the Critique of Pure Reason, not just in his pre-critical ones. And this whole thing is just terribly inconsistent, once again. If you think about it, it depends first on assuming that the soul and the body are, even as things in themselves, two different things. So if you think about it, it rests on a lot of assumptions. First, that there is a thing in itself and not just appearances, which is something that transcendental idealism doesn't really need and that Fichte got rid of. Second, it rests on the assumption that there are several things in themselves and not just one, thereby applying the category of multiplicity. So it assumes that I don't just appear to myself as having two different parts, a psyche and a body, but that behind those appearances there are also two different things in themselves, even if those are, unlike psyche and body, unlike their appearances, of a similar kind. They are still envisioned by Kant as two different objects. And then Kant applies all three categories of relation here. So he imagines these two things in themselves as two substances. He imagines them as being related as cause and effect, so as influencing each other. And he imagines them as being in community, not through space, but through God, as being part of the same world because they are part of God's intellect, so to say. And all of this is in direct contradiction to Kant's whole critical philosophy. I mean, the point that Kant is making in the Critique of Pure Reason, and that I explained several times in previous lectures, the whole point is we have these 12 categories of thinking, which I discussed in the lecture on the table of categories. And yes, we can go beyond the appearances. We can go beyond experience with these categories. We can think of things in themselves along those categories. But Kant's point is, those end up being empty thoughts then. We don't know if we have thought of something or of nothing then. We are only allowed to apply these categories to things either that we actually do experience or that we at least potentially could experience. That is why I talked about this in the lecture on the schematism and the principles. That is why the categories to be applied and to gain reality need the schemata. The schemata filling these empty forms, so to say, with time as their content. I can only think of a substance as that which persists in time when its state changes. I can only think of causality properly when I think of it as one thing in time coming first, and then the other thing, the effect being caused by it, coming necessarily after it. I can only think of community as two things necessarily being in the same time. And without these temporal schemata, my categories become empty thoughts that I simply can't apply. But here, Kant is doing precisely that. He is using, apparently without realizing, he's using the categories and thinking about the things in themselves. And really, in his own terms, this is not critical philosophy, this is dogmatism. But this is also one reason I wanted to talk about this, because these lectures are not just meant to talk about what is right and true in Kant's philosophy and what we should take up of Kant's thought, but rather they are meant to present the whole Kant, the true and the untrue parts, the things he was correct about and the errors he made. And so I don't want to gloss over about this part, especially since I think it is in a way important to understand Kant. As someone who at some point had read all of Kant's published works, which is more than most people, even most professors, will ever read of Kant, but who had not yet read Kant's notes and his lectures, but since has also read those, I can tell you that if you read only the books that Kant published, you will get a distorted picture of Kant, and you will probably think that Kant, as a philosopher, was further ahead than he as a person really was. In his notes and in his lectures, you can see him even later, even after publishing the critiques, still holding some pre-critical, some dogmatic beliefs. You can see that he as a person, in many cases, didn't really move beyond the Leibniz-Wolffian school philosophy in which he had grown up and which he had come to criticize. This should not be so surprising. I mean, the whole critical philosophy and transcendental idealism is a completely new and revolutionary thought. And anyone coming up with something completely new while himself being born and raised in the old will probably be inconsistent, will probably not be able to completely let go of the old and to completely embrace the new. It is a great accomplishment to come up with the new at all, to start the revolution at all. And it is then left to a later generation, which maybe already grows up with it, to finish that work and to be more consistent, which is exactly what Fichte did for Kant. But Kant himself, in his published works, he is often very critical and therefore very careful, because he is really just dealing with the critique of reason, with trying to show what we can't and what we can know, while not making actual statements about the content of that knowledge, even when it comes to the things that potentially we can know. But in his more, let's say, private works, like his notes or his lectures to his students, you maybe get a somewhat better picture of what Kant actually thought and believed apart from his critique of reason. And here you will find that often, as a person, he was sort of passed and overtaken and sort of as a person left behind by his own critical thinking. And that, I think, is important to know and to realize if you really want to understand Kant as a person as a whole. And this really goes for all parts of his thinking, like for the theoretical as well as for the practical. So, Kant has great accomplishments and laid the fundament for a completely new structure of philosophy, so to say. But he himself didn't really build the building on his own new fundament, but rather in his opinions about the soul, but also about God or about morality, stayed in the old and shaky building erected on the fundament which he himself had actually destroyed. But anyways, so both of these topics, the Kant's refutation of empirical idealism and Kant's solution to the body-soul problem, actually show how Kant was not fully in tune with his own critical philosophy when it came to actually applying it and actually reaching the consequences you should reach from it. But anyways, back to rational psychology in general. What Kant says, basically after refuting the four paralogisms and showing that what is analytically true for that I of our thinking, for the thinking subject, is not necessarily synthetically true for our soul. What he says is, well, we only really know our soul, that is once again our psyche, from our inner experience, we cannot say, since we only experience our soul here in life, in connection to the physical world, we cannot say what it is independently of life and of that physical world, and if it is even anything independently of that. So all all attempts to make such conclusions and synthetic judgments about the soul must fail. So we can, for example, not say that the soul, since it is a substance, and since substances, as any physicist knows, and as Kant's principles show, since substances cannot be destroyed, therefore the soul must be immortal. We cannot say that, Kant would say, because for one, we know substances only as material substances through the outer sense, and we don't know of any other kind of substances, because for one, we know of substances only as that which persists throughout all experience and throughout all changes of the state of the substance. Only through this ultimately temporal schema can I recognize something as a substance. Only through this schema can I apply my concept of a substance to something. But if the soul subsists, is something I don't know. I have no experience of that. Because I have not yet experienced the soul past my death. So I don't know if the soul will remain even through this change of its state, or if it will vanish. And therefore, I don't know if the soul is a substance. Because this concept of a substance, of something existing by itself and not as another thing's attribute, I can't apply, I can't understand, unless it is through this temporal schema of subsistence and persistence. And on the other hand, I can also not conclude this persistence from the soul being a substance, because even if it was a substance, and even if I could prove somehow that it was, which again I can't if I don't know that it persists, because that is my only way of recognizing something as a substance. But even if I somehow could recognize it as a substance without finding that it is persistent, I could then not draw the conclusion that since it is a substance, it must always persist. Because that is not true for all substances, but only for all substances I know of so far. But I have no way of knowing if maybe it is possible for something to be a substance without persisting. So for something to exist not as another's attribute, but still not exist forever, and still only exist for a moment and then be destroyed again. I don't know that. So in that sense, we cannot do rational psychology. We have, once again, these two forms of apperception, and the empirical apperception allows only for empirical psychology, which is what we today call psychology. So it allows for me, through inner experience, through observation, and maybe also experiment on my psyche, try to find out about how my psyche works. But then I will only learn about my psyche as an appearance, as this thing which appears here in life, and not learn anything about the soul independent of life. And on the other hand, I have transcendental apperception, and that, Kant says, is the fundament of logic. Because after all, transcendental apperception is taking all my representations and synthesizing them as being my representations as being thought by me. And this is a condition of the possibility of thinking. I could not think of anything without connecting it in that way. And therefore, the ways I do this connection, the ways in which transcendental apperception happens, are at the same time the basic laws, the basic forms all thoughts have to follow. And those the logician can deal with. And those are exactly the 12 functions of judgment that Kant talks about in the table of judgments, and about which I already made its own lecture. These are the 12 forms in which we do this transcendental apperception, in which we connect our thoughts, and therefore logic is based on this transcendental apperception. But these are the only two sciences, empirical psychology and logic, which I can base on my two apperceptions. I have no basis for a rational psychology. So what does this mean for this subject of metaphysics? Kant says it means that it can never be a doctrine, but it can still be a discipline. Because to Kant, every science can either be a doctrine or a discipline. And doctrine would mean a positive teaching that expands our knowledge, that teaches us new things. And if rational psychology was a doctrine, then it would become pneumatology, Kant says. From the Greek pneuma for spirit, so it would then be a doctrine of spirits. It would be a science, a metaphysical science, teaching us about the nature of spiritual beings, of our own soul, but really about all spiritual beings, or also about possible angels or whatever. And such a positive science that is its own doctrine is not possible. But to Kant, that doesn't mean that we have to throw rational psychology away completely and stop doing it completely. He says it still has its place in metaphysics as a discipline. And discipline to him means a negative science that is not teaching us new things, but that is preventing errors, and that is limiting us and telling us where we have to stop trying to find new things, because it simply won't work and will only lead again to errors. And this is sort of Kant's whole point in metaphysics. This is not just what he will say about rational psychology, but also about rational cosmology or rational theology, that they should be not positive doctrines, but negative disciplines. To him, the role of philosophy, or rather of metaphysics as the core of philosophy, is largely negative, not teaching us new things, but preventing getting lost in errors. Here I refer back to my lecture on the conflict of faculties, where I described how, according to Kant, the three higher faculties of theology, jurisprudence, and medicine, they promise the people, or the people seek them out for that, positive solutions to their problems. And I explained there how, to Kant, the role of philosophy should be rather a negative role, rather telling people what not to do, how not to think, because it will only lead to errors and problems and issues. And you could say, I explained in that lecture, that the whole critical project is there to remind the metaphysicians of this role of theirs, to teach them that they should not try to be what these other faculties are, but rather they should embrace their role as discipliners of thinking, as preventers of errors. Well, what are these possible errors that rational psychology could prevent? They are what Kant calls spiritualism and materialism. Spiritualism here doesn't mean what it maybe means today. So when someone says, "Oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual," rather both are positions you can take on the soul. So spiritualism would be the opinion that our soul is a spirit which can exist independently of the body. So spiritualism is exactly what all these four paralogisms lead to. And on the other hand, materialism is here understood as the opinion that we don't have a spiritual soul. So our psyche, our consciousness is just a product of matter, of our material body, of our brain. Now, spiritualism is refuted with the paralogisms, but Kant says that this should not lead us to believe in materialism, which of course today most people do believe in, which of course today is the leading worldview. Rather, he says that rational psychology can refute materialism too. It is basically already refuted with Kant's transcendental idealism, right? And here you can go back to my lecture on that. Once we realize that the things we perceive, including our body and including our brain, are not things in themselves, but are just the things that appear to us. And as soon as we realize that the laws under which they appear, like the law of causality, which is of course needed if I want to say my brain causes my consciousness, that these laws too are just the laws according to which they have to appear. And they can't possibly appear unless under these laws, but that doesn't mean that as things in themselves they are under these laws. As soon as I realize that, then I have no reason anymore to believe that my brain causes my consciousness. Kant says we don't have to fear that if matter were to vanish, our thinking would vanish too, because it only comes out of matter. Rather, with transcendental idealism, we realize the opposite. We realize that if our thinking were to stop, all matter would disappear, because matter, extended things in space, only exists for us. It is what we are viewing in our form of viewing in space, but the things in themselves are not spatially extended matter. So really, whenever someone tells you my consciousness is the product of my brain, you simply have to ask them, okay, and where's your brain? How do you know of your brain existing and causing this consciousness? Whether they like it or not, they will have to answer you, my brain is in my consciousness. I am conscious of my brain. I know of my brain because I am conscious of it. But if the brain is in the consciousness, there's no reason to believe that it caused the consciousness. Also, here once again, Kant mentions this argument that thinking must be simple. He says that our thoughts must be the thought of one and the same subject, or else they could not be understood as being the same thoughts of the same subject. I previously mentioned Kant's example of several people each knowing one word of a verse. No one would know the whole verse or the whole poem. They would all just know one word. So Kant says that means that since our brain is not simple, it is made up of several parts. It is made up of several brain areas and several cells and several atoms. a thought would have to be in one part of the brain or in another. And if it was divided into several parts, so one part of the thought being in this area of the brain and one part of the thought being in this area, then there's no way for us to understand how these different parts of the thought could come together to form one coherent thought. And when it comes to materialism, nowadays, since again this is the reigning ideology, and it really is that, it is an ideology, it is not a scientific position, it is completely unscientific, and it is simply, which is the mark of an ideology, dogmatically believed without proof. When it comes to materialism, you will now often hear the claim that we now know more than they did at Kant's time. There's now this hype of the study of the brain, and you will hear the claim that through the study of the brain, that natural science, that biology are doing, we will get to understand consciousness. That shows you that people making such a claim really know nothing of the very basics of philosophy, because, I mean, if you study the brain, the only thing you can possibly understand is how the brain works. But you cannot, through study of the brain, get any closer to understanding consciousness. Now, I don't want to dismiss those studies. I don't want to say they are useless or uninteresting or completely wrong. As study of the brain, they may have their value, but it's simply the brain you are studying and not consciousness. And the fact that this gets confused shows you that the very basics of philosophy, and it is Kant's accomplishment to reach such clarity about those basics, that the very basics of philosophy are lacking. People, including natural scientists, including even many so-called philosophers, often have not learned to distinguish between the sensual and the supersensual. Kant's whole philosophy is based on that distinction, and I already made a lecture about that. So people will tell you that since we now know so much more about the brain, what previous philosophers, including Kant, had to say about consciousness doesn't matter anymore. It's refuted now. It's not relevant anymore. You will hear people saying, if Kant had known what we know today, he would have had a different position. And again, you hear this not just by natural scientists who at least have some sort of excuse when they are ignorant about philosophy because it is not their subject. No, I have even heard that when studying, and not just from co-eds in their first semester who didn't know any better. No, you can even hear that from many professors. But the thing is, nothing we learn about the brain changes the fundamental positions we can have regarding materialism or spiritualism or idealism, even in the slightest. Like, I have had people tell me that, nowadays Kant couldn't know about this, but nowadays we know that if the brain is affected in a certain way, that leads to certain thoughts or to certain feelings. So clearly the thinking is caused by the brain. And I really have to wonder, when someone talks like that, do they listen to themselves? Do they realize what they are saying? Of course this was known to Kant. This was known, I would assume, since the Stone Age. I mean, do you really think this is a new knowledge that we only acquired in the last few decades, that influencing the body, influencing the brain, can influence your thoughts? I mean, I'm pretty sure that in Kant's time they were aware that if you get drunk, that very much affects your thinking. Or if you are very sick, if you are feverish, that affects your thinking. Or I'm pretty sure they were aware that there is such a thing as mental disabilities that some people are born with. I mean, I'm not saying that we didn't acquire any new knowledge. We now may know better about how exactly these things work. We now may know better which area of the brain is affected in which way when you get drunk or when you have a fever. But the basic knowledge that somehow when the brain gets affected, this can affect our thinking and even make us unable to think, that is not new knowledge. And that is all that is needed in the discussion of this general question of materialism. The exact details and workings of how the brain affects the thinking don't contribute to the question if the thinking at all depends on the brain or not. What does Kant have to say here? What he says is that, of course, you cannot refute materialism by proving spiritualism. I mean, his whole point in refuting the four paralogisms is that spiritualism cannot be proven. But that is also not necessary, Kant says. It is enough to show that materialism also can't be proven, and that the materialist explanation is not the only possible explanation. Because if you have a phenomenon, like, for example, getting drunk or taking drugs, changing the way you think, and there's only one possible hypothesis to explain it, that would be the materialist hypothesis in this case, then you have to go with this hypothesis. But Kant says, if you can up with a second hypothesis, which could explain the same phenomenon, then you have no reason to believe in the first hypothesis. You also have no reason to believe in the second one, but that's not the point. The point is just to show that materialism is not the only possible explanation of the observable phenomena. Kant says that when it comes to metaphysics, there is no such thing as likelihood. Only when it comes to empirical questions can we talk about something being more or less likely. But in metaphysics, we can only talk about absolute conviction, so being sure of something, or absolute ignorance, so not being sure of something. But there is no such thing as partial conviction here, as saying something is not proven completely, but it is likely to be true. Kant gives an example of how you can answer to the hypothesis of materialism with a different hypothesis. He gives an analogy. Think of the soul as a person, and think of thinking as that person walking. And now imagine that person was chained to a cart, that cart being the body. The cart would now weight that person down. And if you load that cart with heavy objects, the more you load that cart, the harder it will get for that person chained to the cart to keep walking. Or also if the wheels of the cart don't work properly, then the person will have a harder time dragging the cart forward. And you could even load the cart with such heavy objects, or you could even block the wheels of the cart so much that the person chained to that cart could struggle and pull with all his strength and still not move the cart 1 inch, which maybe is what happens in a mental disability or when someone gets Alzheimer's. But still, that doesn't prove that walking is caused by that card. Quite the opposite. If the person was now freed from the card, if the chain was broken, which would be death and the soul leaving the body, far from the person losing the ability to walk, instead the person could now walk and even run more freely and with more ease and faster than ever, Kant says. So if this analogy describes the truth, then that would mean that the body, or more specifically the brain, is not what causes thinking, but rather is what hinders thinking. And then that would mean that once we die and our soul separates from the body and becomes a free spirit, not only would our consciousness not end, but rather we would become more conscious. We would think with more clarity. Now, Kant stresses that this analogy is merely a hypothesis. He doesn't have any proof for it. It is not even likely, because again, we cannot speak of likelihood in metaphysics. We can only have knowledge or ignorance. But the thing is, this is a possible explanation for all the phenomena. This is a possible explanation for everything that natural scientists find when researching and experimenting with the brain. Yes, they do find that what we think is influenced by the brain, but with this analogy, we can show that this doesn't necessarily, but only possibly mean that the brain is the cause of the thinking. It could also mean that the brain is actually what hinders thinking and what drags our thinking down. And that, according to Kant, is all that's needed. We don't need to actually prove the opposing hypothesis to materialism. We just need to show that another possible explanation can be given, and therefore there is no reason to believe that the explanation of materialism must be true. And that is basically the point of rational psychology to Kant. Again, the point is it can't be a doctrine, it can't prove anything, but it can be a discipline and can make sure that we don't fall into our own traps, that we don't convince ourselves of having proved something one way or the other, which actually can't be proven. We can't go beyond the realm of experience with our thinking, or rather, with our thinking we can, but then those are empty thoughts. With our knowledge, we can't go beyond the realm of experience, and therefore we can't know neither that we do have a spiritual soul, nor that we don't have a spiritual soul and are just our brains, basically. That is the result of Kant's theoretical philosophy when it comes to the soul. Now, this is precisely what leaves room for a belief in the soul and in the immortality of the soul, Kant says. If materialism could be proven without a doubt, then you had no right to believe in your soul being immortal. But since materialism cannot be proven, you can believe that your soul is immortal. You can't know it, because materialism can also not be disproven, but you can believe it. However, I will stress that to Kant, belief should not just be, I choose to believe in it because I like the idea of the immortal soul. I don't like the thought of dying and then just vanishing. That would not be enough for belief, according to Kant, because that would then be an irrational belief, a belief based on your desires and not on reason. The question to Kant is there maybe a rational reason to believe in the immortality of the soul? A proof there isn't, but maybe there can be a reason which satisfies not just our desire to never vanish, but that satisfies our reason enough to entertain this idea. And this I will talk about when I get to Kant's philosophy of religion. I will talk about the moral reason that Kant gives for believing in the immortality of the soul. But here, when it comes to theoretical philosophy, the result of the whole inquiry is basically saying we can't know one way or another. And that is precisely the fundament for maybe, if we find a reason for that, believing one way or another. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pei, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.